So thank you. We purposefully developed the agenda to start describing the problem and sharing the data. But what we want to focus on today is the solutions. And obviously, we're looking at the anchor institution strategy as one of those solutions. And to help us in that conversation, we have Ted Howard, the president and founder of the Democracy Collaborative, which is the national consultant that has been partnering with Health Foundation in the assessment of our anchor institutions here in South Florida. We have about 6 anchor institutions, by the way, that have been formally engaged in the assessment phase. And then we also have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Lucy Kerman, who's Senior Vice Provost at Drexel University.
So, I've answered the first question. I can actually stand here. I've been sitting there for 45 minutes wondering if I was going to be able to do this. All right. So, no, it's okay. I'll say lean forward. So, well, greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks so much to the Health Foundation of South Florida for this really impressive initiative. You all are meeting here in this hotel room in Miami, but you're not alone. There is across the country meetings like this happening every week in communities, many of them we work with at the Democracy Collaborative, who are trying to find this new way that Ned was talking about for a new type of community and economic development. And in particular, committed to leveraging the assets that are in their communities already, anchor institutions. So I'm going to talk about anchor institutions and give you some examples of that. Then Lucy is really, she's the one you want to listen to, because she's at work in her institution transforming how that institution does business in Philadelphia and getting a lot of traction. So I'm going to kind of set the stage, hopefully quickly, turn it over to Lucy. I did want to start with just the general frame so you know my, in a sense, bias, how I approach these things. We are very focused at the Democracy Collaborative, not only on the creation of decent work with family supporting incomes, but the very critical importance of supplementing incomes with assets. As it says on this slide, you know, jobs can lift you out of poverty, but to stay out of poverty requires that your family has access to some sort of assets and wealth that can be reinvested for the long haul. So we think that asset creation as part of a strategy like the one you're talking about is very, very important, not just jobs, as important as jobs are. We call this community wealth building. It's a new approach to economic development that some of you outside you may have seen. There's a little pamphlet that we produce at the Democracy Collaborative, and it talks about the nature of community wealth building, but really it's a sort of systems approach. And when we began this, Steve, the president of the foundation, talked about the new mission statement is really about systemic change. And at least when I think about that, if you look at Miami, your community, it is a system. There are institutions and policies and structures, and they interact in certain ways, and they produce certain kinds of outcomes. I live in Cleveland, Ohio. It's the very same thing. And we need to look at what is our system that we live in producing. Now, I don't know your community well, but I know Cleveland, Ohio very, very well. And I could tell you what that system is producing as a natural consequence of how the system works is greater levels of poverty, more disinvestment, more people being left behind, worse environmental outcomes. It's not that there are bad people that want that to happen, it's that we've got a system constructed in that way. And so the question for us, and I think the challenge is, can we imagine constructing a system in Cleveland, Ohio, or in Miami, or any of our communities that produces different kinds of outcomes? But today's Monday. Imagine you woke up in a couple years on a Tuesday in Miami and you said, this is a great day because yesterday our system produced greater wealth equality for our citizens. Just imagine we had a system like that. And I think that's the big vision of what we're going for, not merely some jobs, as important as they are, not simply to address some aspects of poverty, but a fundamental systemic change. In that yellow pamphlet, we talk about the drivers of community wealth building, so I won't spend much time on this. But just to say, traditional economic development, what it's mostly about is bundling up a lot of our money, public subsidies and taxes, tax abatements and so forth, and trying to get a company, to leave Milwaukee and come to Cleveland and bring your jobs, which is great for Cleveland, except 200 people in Milwaukee lost their jobs as a result. And the company's not really all that loyal to Cleveland because in 6 years, the subsidies run out and North Carolina gives them a better offer and off they go. So community wealth building is not about that. It's trying to leverage what we have. It's focusing on place, how important place is. If you want to address disinvestment in a city, you can't just focus on the larger economy and hope things will trickle down. I live in a neighborhood in Cleveland. It's 98.5% African American. It's called Glenville. That neighborhood, the average life expectancy for one of my neighbors who's a man, an African American man, is 64 years. Due east, 8 miles in the white suburb of Lyndhurst, the average life expectancy for a man, a white man, is 88 years. In 8 miles, 24 years of life. So if we want to address that 24-year gap, we have got to focus where people live. Community wealth building is very much about broadening ownership. We think that it's great that individual entrepreneurs have companies. We'd like to create more companies where all the people working in them have an equity stake so that as they're profitable, they can share in those profits. The question of multipliers is very important. We heard about the incredible economic activity in some of the lowest income neighborhoods in the city. There's a lot of money flowing through those neighborhoods. One of the problems is so much of it leaves the local neighborhood. So how do we capture that money and keep it in our community and keep getting a multiplier effect to put people to work? So when we think of a community wealth building, we think of creating an ecosystem, not just a project or initiative or a policy, but an ecosystem that can produce the results we want. And we see it in 3 ways. One, programs that enable people to build their individual assets. Things like children's savings accounts you may have heard about. Then there are ways of organizing ownership over productive capital, like cooperatives and employee ownership and community land trusts and things that bring real benefit to the whole community. But the third piece, and this is what I'm really going to talk about, is the power of anchor institutions. That we have in our midst these enormous economic engines that could be harnessed for the benefit of our community, and that's what this conversation is really about. What are anchor institutions? Well, they're often called eds and meds, universities and hospitals, but as Steve said, they're much more than that. Local government. The government of Miami is not outsourcing itself to China. It's going to be here for the long haul. Cultural institutions, place-based philanthropy. In a sense, the Health Foundation of South Florida is an anchor institution. Now, it's not a big employer, it's not a big purchaser of goods and services, but it's here in your community for the long haul. It's going to be here. And so economists call this sticky capital. In 100 years, businesses all over this city will come and go. The University of Miami is going to be here. FIU is going to be here. It'll probably just be bigger. So these are very, very important institutions in our community. And on a national basis, enormously important. So just the universities and hospitals in America employ over 9 million people. It's a very large percentage of the labor market in the United States. Annual expenditures, just to keep the doors open from all the colleges and universities, over $1.2 trillion. Now bear in mind, this is money that's locked in place because the University of Miami is not going anywhere. So that money's there. The question becomes, how can we leverage it for the benefit of the community? Annual procurement of $500 million. Investment portfolios, $750 billion. Almost all of that $750 billion, however, is not being invested with the lens of how do we invest to help our community. It's going into Wall Street and equities and so forth. Not that that's wrong, but $750 billion that could be benefiting our communities. So I don't know about you, but where I'm from, a couple $1 trillion looks like a lot of money. And the game is, how do we work with the institutions to drive as much of that as possible into our communities? Not as a charitable impulse for the institutions, But as a business proposition, it is better for Drexel to conduct itself in the way that Lucy is going to describe than the old way that it was conducting itself, and it's better for the community. So the next two slides are, I think, the most important that I'm going to share with you. What's important in my view is that when a university wants to step up and really conduct itself in a way that's a strong partner to the community, or a hospital wants to step up, that they not think of it as, well, here we are as a university, and we have thousands of employees, and maybe billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of budget, and we're going to set up a little office over here with 5 people to do something good for the community. The question becomes, how do you go all in on this strategy? And we call this at the Collaborative the anchor mission. And this phrasing was hammered out by a group of universities. Lucy's University Drexel was part of the process to come up with this definition. The anchor mission is a commitment to intentionally apply an institution's long-term place-based economic power and human capital in partnership with the community to mutually benefit the long-term well-being of both. So not doing something for or to the community, but in partnership with the community, and exhibiting the intentionality to bring all of the economic power and all of the people and intellectual power together for a new approach to running that business, even though it's a nonprofit business. So what does this look like? One of the institutions we work with is Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest health systems in the country. Kaiser's a nonprofit. Now I run a nonprofit. This nonprofit had revenues of $65 billion last year, 188,000 employees. If it was a for-profit, it would be listed on the Fortune 500 as number 51. 51st largest corporation in America is a nonprofit. And it has bought the idea of, we want to express at our core, our DNA as an institution, the anchor mission. And so it created this diagram. This is not mine. And it looked at all of its functional aspects of running something called Kaiser Permanente. And it's systematically asking itself, how do we now conduct our procurement in a way that's consistent with going all in for mission? How do we run our facilities, our hundreds of buildings all over the country, in a way that benefits our community? How do we run our IT department? I mean, the answers to these questions are not completely clear. I was at the university, or I was in Rochester, New York, where we do work, and Rochester Regional Hospital. A very interesting meeting where a vice president assembled the heads of all the units of HR and supply chain and so forth. And he asked each one of these people, how would you change what you're doing in your department if you were expressing this anchor mission? And so, you know, the person running the cafeteria is, well, we buy more food locally, kind of what you saw there. You know, and that's a clear answer. And then we got to the guy who had security, the police department. And I thought, what is this fellow going to say? And he looked like just what he was. He was an ex-New York cop who was like twice as broad as me and a brush cut, and you would not want to mess with this guy. And I thought, is he just going to say this is nonsense? How would you run a police department in a different way? And he said, you know, I've been thinking about it in this conversation. I realized we've got a police force of 35 people. They're all ex-New York cops, and they all look like me. It'd be a formidable football team. Across the street from our campus is a very low-income neighborhood. Everyone who lives there is African American. We've never taken the step of going out to recruit our workforce, our police force, from the neighborhood. Now, they're not ex-cops, so it'll take more to support them, but they live in the neighborhood. They know who the bad actors are, and there's some bad actors in that neighborhood that want to come into the hospital to see if they could get drugs or whatever. So if we were to train people from the community to be part of the police force, they could screen who's coming in here. They would get jobs, and it'd be better for our institution. So even a police department can think through, how do you express an anchor mission? One of the, I'm going to talk about 2 trends before I turn this over to Lucy. 2 trends taking place in anchor institution work. It used to be anchor institutions were just kind of going it alone, one institution trying to do its thing. two trends that have emerged that are very important. First, there are networks or collaborations of multiple institutions working together. We have started a couple national networks. One is called the Healthcare Anchor Network. It's a network of 30 of the largest health systems in the country. There's some of them there. We just came off a 3-day meeting in Chicago of all these institutions. And you think of, well, 30 health systems, is that, what does that mean? Well, this is what it means. They represent over 1/10 of all the hospitals in the United States of America. They employ more than 1 million people, purchase over $50 billion annually, invest over $150 billion in their assets. And we're working with them systematically, and they're learning from one another about how to do this anchor mission approach, investing in their community. They're focused particularly, and if you're interested, you can download this from our Democracy Collaborative website. They're focused particularly on inclusive hiring, inclusive local purchasing and sourcing, and place-based investing. So, and these are toolkits that we developed with support from Robert Wood Johnson. So there's lots of knowledge about how to do this. So those of you in anchor institutions here, I know it takes a lot to move in this direction because there are traditional corporate culture issues and procedures and ways of approach. But there's a lot to draw upon. You're not the first people having to make it up. You need to, there's not a cookie cutter approach, but there's a lot of support that you can have. And I'll end with just the second trend was, so there are national networks. We work with the Healthcare Anchor Network. We've put together one with Drexel and others on universities working in the same way. But then there are also collaborations locally, which is what's being talked about here. In Cleveland, Ohio, I was involved in starting this one. It's called the Greater University Circle Initiative. It involves the city's major hospitals, which, by the way, are 2 of the 5 largest private employers in the entire state of Ohio, Cleveland Clinic and University Hospitals, Case Western Reserve University, the city government, the Regional Transit Authority, and so forth, all working to invest in the local community through targeting their procurement, targeting their hiring to bring people from low-income neighborhoods that have been excluded from ever working in these institutions before. To date, they've created, in the last couple of years, about 800 jobs for people locally. These are living wage jobs. A number of them, 150 of these people, work in a network of worker-owned cooperatives called the Evergreen Cooperatives. So they own the company as these companies produce goods and services to the universities and hospitals. And it's a growing effort in the city to revitalize a very low-income area where the median household income for a family of 4 is below $18,500. Yet these neighborhoods are right across the street from these multi-billion-dollar institutions. In Chicago, Mayor Rahm Emanuel really used his sort of bully pulpit to bring together 15 anchor institutions who are working to buy locally from minority and women-owned companies. And there's an organization that they began called Chicago Anchors for a Strong Economy, or CASE. Each of these anchor institutions pays dues as a member, and CASE sort of serves as a broker to find small minority businesses in the community that are capable of providing the goods and services that these anchor institutions need. So it's a kind of backbone to facilitate these institutions doing what they want. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, we're working down there, my organization, the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center contacted us and said, we have one of the highest incidents of child poverty in the nation, and we want to do something about it. So we helped them create something called Healthy Neighborhoods Albuquerque. And this is their group of anchors. The public school system, the community foundation, the community college, a couple of the health systems. By the way, these 2 hospital systems, University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center and Presbyterian, they're fierce competitors. They're just out there in the market beating each other's brains out every day. So this isn't like a little kumbaya thing. People said they may never sit down together and work together. But on this, they're willing to do that. And what they're doing is they're particularly focused on local food, and they're aggregating their demand to help jumpstart the local food economy. Because if you remember, community wealth building is about achieving a multiplier and not let money leak. They did an assessment. If you're eating in New Mexico, 98% of the food consumed in New Mexico isn't even grown in the state. So all your money is just being sucked out to California and Arizona. So they said, let's start our own food system here. We purchase a lot of food in the school systems, and they're helping to start a whole system of locally grown food in the state. And then finally, in Newark, Mayor Ross Baraka went out and he did an assessment of all the jobs held in Newark. He asked the question, how many of those jobs are held by residents of Newark? It's an interesting question. Well, it turned out 17%. All the rest are held by people in the suburbs who are driving into the city. He said, this is insane. So he went anchor institution, including some for-profits like Prudential Life Insurance, and said, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to make a commitment publicly to how many new jobs you're going to create that will be held by local residents of this city. And so they started something called Newark 2020 with the ambitious goal of creating 2,020 new jobs in these companies and institutions, these anchors, by the year 2020. And he's a very smart politician. He did a big press conference. He got the CEO of every anchor institution to come forward and say the number they were going to create, and it's all on videotape. So it's the best way to do it. So last thing I'd say, I have one more slide. So when Ned was giving his very powerful presentation, he really talked about, that this sort of system of community and economic development we have is just not moving the needle. That we have to, your words, I think, were get outside the box. We have got to start new thinking. And so for me, I'm inspired in this work by one quote, another academic, Nobel Prize winning academic, named Albert Einstein, who said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And for me, what you all are up to here is a bold, a very radical new kind of thinking about how do we take the precious assets that are in our community and make the most of them. Leverage them so that the institutions become even greater and more world-class, and our community is uplifted, because truly we are all in this together. The community is not going to succeed without the power of the anchor institutions, and ultimately the anchors are not going to succeed either without the community rising as well. So I want to acknowledge and congratulate you all on the work you're doing, and really look forward to following your progress in the coming years. Thank you.